The Pharisees get a bad rap, I think. Indeed, there were probably some jerks who were Pharisees. That probably goes without saying. But probably not all of them. Many of them, I suspect, were people who were just doing their darndest to follow what they understood was the thing that faithful people should do. And so they followed the laws. And they wanted all of the other people that aligned with them, the other Jews, and Jesus was a Jew. They wanted the other Jews to do the very same thing. And they became sort of police about it, if you will. And were holding the others accountable, if you will. Because it's easy to follow a law and measure. You know, if the speed limit is 50 miles an hour and you're going 75, it's easy to measure that you're doing something that's not right. Well, if you have the laws and you're traveling 75, you know you've broken the law. Well, we read the Ten Commandments, and not that that's all the law that the Jews followed, but that certainly was a summary of it. And you heard that there was a requirement to follow the Sabbath. Do no work. You, your sons or your daughters or your wife or the servants or even the immigrants who live with you. And they get to rest too. And Jesus' disciples, not Jesus, did you notice? It didn't say that Jesus picked the grain, but Jesus' disciples picked the grain. And there's an assumption that Jesus was supposed to look out for his disciples and make sure that they did what was right. But they picked the grain, and the Pharisees just held Jesus accountable. After all, it's only the right thing to do, isn't it? To follow the law. And then Jesus, in the way that he did time and time again, and only the way that Jesus said, Sabbath, you know, the Sabbath that was mentioned in the Ten Commandments, Sabbath, isn't something that humans were created to fulfill, but rather the Sabbath was created to benefit humans. And so, what does that mean for them? I suspect that set the Pharisees, others who tended to follow the law pretty strictly, probably set them back on their heels to hear him say that. Because it sort of calls into question, at least on the surface, the law. What do? I remember in my Sociology 101 class, the term enemy. You remember that term, folks? Enemy is the absence of laws, and if we have an absence of laws or social customs or mores, then it's just chaos among us. If we just threw out the law book here in Kennebunkport, in the state of Maine, in the United States, if we just threw it out and let everybody do just what they want, chaos would erupt. Well, was that what Jesus was proposing? I don't think so. But he was proposing a different way to look at the law, a different way to follow what was important. And what he said is, these laws are intended to make life better for us. In fact, if we go back to the book of Deuteronomy, we read the Ten Commandments, and that ended at verse 22. But if we jump down to verse 29, it says, if only their minds were like this, always fearing me and keeping all my commandments. Why? So that things would go well for them and their children forever. So that things would go well for them and for their children forever. The laws weren't created just so that we could keep some sort of report card, but rather the kingdom has things for us to follow so that things will go well for us. Well, that's probably pretty obvious when we think about the Ten Commandments, even though I'm not sure we always keep the Ten Commandments, but that's probably another sermon. But do we follow the law that informs our faith, the laws that inform our culture for the sake of the well-being of all of us, or for the rigidity of the law? And not only do we follow the law, but do we follow those things that are written as well as the things that aren't written? The things that we've sort of accepted, not sort of, we've accepted as the norm for us, as the norm for what we're about. I don't know, probably this doesn't happen at Church on the Cape, but in many congregations, there are people who own their pew. The last church I served, St. John's Church in Dover, New Hampshire, when they were in their old building, they had a carillon in the tower, and the man who rang the carillon would come early, and he put his coat on his seat. And God forbid anybody should ever sit, his name was Charlie Brown, should ever sit in Charlie Brown's seat. Maybe there's another way that Jesus would ask us about, to consider that. Story that I heard a long time ago, I believe it's true. There was a couple who sat in a seat, their favorite seat for years and years and years. Their kids came to Sunday school and worshiped with them, grew up and moved out, and they had their seat. The man came down with cancer, and the cancer progressed, unfortunately, and got to a point where he could not come to church, and when he didn't come to church, his wife didn't come to church either, so they stopped. And she took care of him at home, and it was an ordeal that dragged on for a while, and he finally passed away. Took her a while before she was comfortable in going back to church again, but she went back, and she headed across the back of the church and down the side aisle toward her pew. Her pew. And in the interim, between the time that they had stopped coming to church and this day, there had been a new family that came to church. Mom and dad and a couple of kids, and they were sitting in her pew. Lady didn't say anything to them. She sat in the pew behind them. Not her pew. They worshiped together. Experienced worship, and the service came to an end, and people were starting to leave. And she introduced herself to this family after church. And then she told the couple, "You're sitting in my pew." And they apologized, and she said, "Oh, no, I didn't mention it for you to apologize." She said, "I wanted you to know that my husband and I and our kids sat in that pew for years, and my husband just died recently. And that pew has lots of great memories for me. And I'm glad that you're starting new memories for my pew." And she took them out to lunch, and she told them stories about her husband and the things that they had done in that church. I mean, it's an unwritten rule. That's your pew. But what happens when the rule gets stretched and moved a little bit? I know many churches have discretionary funds that the pastor administers. Is that true here? Pastor's discretionary fund, which the pastor is able to help folks in situations who have sort of emergency needs or needs that are just beyond their capabilities at a particular time to get through. And so if the pastor has those funds available to help, whether it's somebody in the church or outside the church, they use it. I had a colleague many years ago who had a pastor's discretionary fund, and in that particular congregation, it was a checkbook, a separate checkbook that the pastor had, and monies were placed there. People gave money, I don't know how they gave money, but they got money into the checkbook. And he was called upon regularly to help people in different situations. Well, there was a point at which somebody called, they needed help with their rent. And usually he had a process he would go through to check to make sure the need was legitimate, but things were busy and it sounded legitimate, and so he wrote a check. And he didn't write it out to the person. He never did that. He wrote it to the landlord and sent the check off. Well, it wasn't terribly long after that that he got another call for rental assistance and fulfilled that, and not long after another call for rental assistance. And he began to think that this was a little odd, but he was really busy. It was a busy time in the life of the church, and he didn't have a lot of extra time to be able to check things out. Till one point, I think it was the summertime, he did have some free time, and he decided that just to check things out, he had taken down the addresses where the people were renting. And he went to the city hall and he checked. Well, the address for one of the places that was written there was a vacant lot. And another one of the addresses was, it wasn't a real address. It didn't exist. And a third one of the addresses, I remember him saying, was for a homeless shelter. They don't charge rent too frequently in homeless shelters. Realized that he had been scammed. Contacted the police. A long story short, it was a family that had been scamming the pastor. They discovered it worked once, and they took it and took advantage of the fact that he was busy. And it amounted to over $3,000 that they had taken. He worked with the police. They got the folks, arrested them, and they pled guilty. Well, part of the settlement was that they had to make restitution to the church, but they also had to go through a process called restorative justice. Restorative justice, where the guilty person and the person who has been affected sit face to face, and the person who has been victimized gets to tell what it was like. Well, the pastor did that 5 times because there were 5 members of the family who had pled guilty, and they met separately every time. Pastor told the perpetrator what it meant to him personally, to feel violated and vulnerable. Spoke about what it meant to the church, because the church was losing trust now, maybe a little bit in the pastor, but clearly in the process of how assistance is given. Told how probably gifts to the discretionary fund would not be coming as easily as they used to, because people might not feel comfortable giving to that anymore. Well, it went on. And at the end of the thing, the people who led, they were from the Maine Council of Churches. They had a restorative justice program. People from Maine Council of Churches led the discussion, and when it seemed like all was done, they said, "Now, is there anything else that either of you have to say?" Well, I guess the perpetrator never said anything at that point. But then the pastor said to the folk, "Now tell me, do you have any real need? Because if you have a real need, the church would want to be able to help you." Well, the law would say, you slam the book. They're guilty as sin, get them gone. But the pastor recognized to a degree that that's not love, that's not the kingdom, that the loving thing to do would be to make sure that their needs were met. Well, as I understand, the effect on every one of the perpetrators was to bring them to tears. But an odd thing happened. It was a strong witness to the people from the Maine Council of Churches as well. They never heard anything like that before. grace happened. Kingdom happened. The rules were followed. But human need was raised as more important than the legality. You notice Jesus never threw out the notion that Sabbath ought to be followed. He never threw that away. That was not an issue for him. But it was an issue for him that we look at the law, we look at those things that are important to us, and ask ourselves, what is the loving thing? What is the human need in this? That's what the kingdom is about. That's what the kingdom is about. I've heard that Pastor Pat is moving, and the Church on the Cape is going through a pastoral change. Maybe this is an opportunity for you to think about the pew you sit in. Oh, not the pew you sit in, but maybe all of those unwritten rules in the church that you know, but Pat's successor may not know. What are the unwritten rules about when things happen and how things happen and where the furniture is placed? Yeah? And when it feels uncomfortable, when whoever that person is challenges you, even if they don't realize they're challenging you, for you to think about that rule. Oh, what is that rule? Oh, it's not written in the book of discipline. No, it's not written in the minutes of the church council meeting. It is not written any place, but it's a rule that you have. For you to ask then, what would be a kingdom response here? What would meet the most basic of human needs here? What would be the grace-filled thing to do here? Not to throw out the rule, but to understand that maybe there's a more excellent way. Maybe there's a more grace-filled way. Maybe there's a way that would witness more to the possibilities of the Spirit moving in us, among us, and through us.
Amen.
Amen.